Wonderful to see the Gran Premio Toscana at Mugello. What a circuit. We should keep this on the calendar forevermore, I think. It's so nice to be going back to a circuit in great surroundings. And don't forget the Mille Miglia used to take place all around there as well. The Futa Pass, the famous Futa Pass, not too far away from Mugello. Plus the Tuscan hills, the weather, everything just so beautiful about it. And to be celebrating Ferrari's 1000th Grand Prix this weekend in Italy at Mugello at their track, well, it's almost too much to take in, isn't it? The reality, though, looking back, and this refers to my intro that hopefully you've just seen, is that it wasn't just 1950. And of course, we can talk about the World Championship began in 1950, but we should always do so in the mind that, of course, the Constructors' World Championship began in 1958. And Formula One didn't actually just begin in 1950. It took place a long time before that, going back to the 1920s. And if you really want to be precise about it, and you assume that we're not talking about just the Drivers' World Championship, we're talking about Ferrari as a team, this is now their 1019th Grand Prix, because they raced in both 1948 and 49. And there were winning races in 49 with that beautiful Lampredi designed Ferrari V12. But just going back to what you saw in the intro, there's Tazio Nuvolari there, there's Achille Vazzi there, and I've put those two in right at the beginning. That's Vazzi with the cigarette, characteristically. I've put those in because they were two of the classic drivers for Enzo Ferrari's Alfa Romeo team, which is how he started. He was a driver first, and then, of course, he took over the management of the Alfa Romeo team. Then he had a fallout with Alfa, and then he decided to take some of the good people from Alfa and set up his own team, moving it from Modena to Maranello. So that needs to be borne in mind, because without everything that happened in the 1930s through to 1950, if you like, without all of that, Ferrari wouldn't have been the man, the commendatore, that he subsequently was in later years. Very impressed to see that Sebastian Vettel has a helmet, a special helmet for this weekend. Charles Leclerc too has lots of famous drivers and cars on the helmet, but I love Sebastian Vettel's helmet, drawing on one side of the current F1000 car and on the other side of the, well, he says it's a 1950 Ferrari 125. I wonder whether it is, whether it's got the leaf spring rear Seb or whether it's got the De Dion rear end. Is it the supercharged car? Yeah, there's lots. 48, of course, is when the 125 first appeared. We shouldn't forget too that the 166 Ferrari preceded the 125, and the first Ferrari Grand Prix car in a Grand Prix was the 1948 Monaco Grand Prix, not the 1950 Monaco Grand Prix, when it was driven by Prince Igor Trubetskoy. And now he was married, would you believe, to Barbara Hutton, the famous Woolworths heir of the time. And she had been previously married to another count and had a son called Lance Reventlow. So therefore the Trubetskoy, who raced at Monaco in 48 in the first Grand Prix appearance of a Ferrari car in a Grand Prix, was the stepfather of Lance Reventlow, who went on, of course, of Scarab fame, raced in Formula One, didn't have the greatest of careers, but the synergy there, just amazing. And Trubetskoy was, of course, his stepfather. Moving on from that, I love the attention to detail at Ferrari too. They've gone to the original red for Ferrari. I think it kind of makes us pleased. When we see it, it's very dark blood red. I think when we see that, we think, isn't it nice that they went to that brighter red that we knew and loved, particularly in the 60s and 70s, because the dark red is quite sinister in certain lights anyway. But I do think it's a little bit of a shame that no attention has been paid to Francesco Baracca, who of course was the Italian fighter pilot who died in World War I, and it was his parents that came to Enzo Ferrari when he was starting his team running the Alfa Romeos and said, look, this was the emblem of our son's fighter squadron. We think it would be really fitting to have this on your racing cars. And it was the prancing horse. And Enzo Ferrari put that, of course, to a yellow background, yellow being the colour of Modena. So that's where all that started, and I see no references to that anywhere, but I think if Enzo Ferrari was with us today, celebrating the 1000th start for a Ferrari car in Formula One since 1950, since the Drivers' World Championship began in 1950, I think he'd be remembering that little moment when the prancing horse came into his life. Anyway, here we are at Mugello. One of the things I love when Formula One, or indeed any racing, and racing drivers, very good racing drivers, go to a good circuit, an interesting circuit with a variety of corners, some long corners, some very high speed change of direction, a long straight too. One of the things I love about that, particularly if there's not a lot of runoff area, which there isn't at Mugello, as Jack Aitken found out in practice for Formula 2 and as Lando Norris found out on Friday afternoon when he went off at turns 3 and 4 and got a little bit too much opposite lock and went into the wall. There, you can hit things here, so it's quite demanding. It's very demanding in that sense. It's also a very physical circuit as well. And as the race goes on, I think we'll find that it will become one of the more physical Grand Prix of the year so far. But one of the things I love is looking at the first flying lap that great drivers do on circuits like this. Now, I know some drivers will have been to Mugello before, but let's assume that to go there in a current Grand Prix car is a new thing and requires a lot of adaptation and a lot of instant response. And that being the case, and also bearing in mind, of course, that when various drivers went out to do their first flying lap, the track was at different stages of evolution. For example, Valtteri Bottas was out much earlier today than Lewis Hamilton. Of course, there is a moment when the drivers have done all their installation, and the drivers, of course, have gone presumably to sims, and some of them anyway, have gone to simulators in the build-up to this. They've talked to the engineers, but there they are going out to do their first flying lap, and they're all brilliant drivers. And I always think it's a fascinating moment to see what sort of lap times they do. So I made a note of them this morning as they went out to do them. Now, as I say, bear in mind, Lewis Hamilton was out quite late. So when he was out to do his first flying lap, the track definitely would have had a little bit more grip than when Valtteri was there. But Lewis's first flying lap around Mugello in the current car, 1:19.9. Next quickest on his first flying lap, Daniel Ricciardo. No real surprise there, bearing in mind how well Daniel's driving now. This is his sort of circuit, so yeah, very good job by him. Third quickest, Max Verstappen, 21.3. Again, no surprise. This is a Max Verstappen sort of weekend, sort of race, isn't it? And then next up, Charles Leclerc, 21.3, same time as Max Verstappen on his first flying lap of Mugello. Now that will be, I think that's Charles having driven so well on very difficult weekends when the car has been completely out of sync with everything that a circuit like Spa or Monza is able to offer. Nonetheless, Charles driving beautifully, suddenly getting to a racetrack which isn't hurting the bad points of the Ferrari quite as much and driving a beautiful lap. So he was really quick early on. Of course, as the weekend progresses, the track gets more grip, everybody gets on top of it. It's going to be a much more difficult weekend for Ferrari. But for those first, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes when Charles was out there doing that lap time, you would think, wow, wasn't this great for Ferrari? And I think it was 2,800 spectators allowed in, socially distanced for the day. Imagine how much they would have loved that moment. And then, isn't this good to see? Kimi Räikkönen, 21.8, his first flying lap. And for sure, Kimi would not have gone to a simulator. Mind you, he's probably driven Mugello before when he was at Ferrari, I would guess. So we should bear that in mind, although everything will be very different now. So it's hardly a true comparison. So Kimi, 21.8. Daniel Kvyat, 21.9. Very impressive. Thinking about, well, you know, I'm quick too. And Valtteri Bottas, 22.1. So Lewis, 19.9 on his first flying lap. Valtteri, 22.1. But again, reiterating the point that the track was definitely quicker when Lewis was out doing his time. Then Pierre Gasly, 22.3, enjoying every moment of being in Italy, having just won at Monza. Alex Albon, 22.6, alongside Max Verstappen's 21.3. Barely revealing. And then Nicholas Latifi, really quick on his first lap, relatively anyway, 22.9. Sebastian Vettel's first flying lap was a 22.7, and Lando Norris did a 23.4, a little bit conservative, but nonetheless right there. So I thought that was really interesting, I thought. And so let's have a look at how it ended up today. Very much team by team at the top. It's Mercedes 1, 2, and then Red Bull 3, 4, and then Renault 5, 6. And then you could kind of say Racing Point up there with Kimi continuing to be quite quick and Charles Leclerc ending up 10th. So Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton, they did a mix and match in terms of tyres. Valtteri was mainly on the medium towards the end and Lewis on the hard. So both tyres looking pretty good and the wear rate not as high, or the energy going through the tyres not as high as the teams were worried about going into this weekend. There's not as much grip out there. The cars are sliding more. There's a little bit more understeer. That'll probably change as the weekend develops, but at the moment, the cars are moving around, or the tyres don't have as much grip as everybody thought they might. Max, as I say, third and fourth. Max pretty impressively clear of Alex Albon, 0.7 quicker by the end there. Daniel Ricciardo and Esteban Ocon, fifth and sixth for Renault. Good performance by both of those drivers. And Sergio Perez, who's awoken to the news or the knowledge, finally reading it in the press or whatever, that he is leaving. They bought him out of his contract, so at least he's going to make a lot of money out of that. That's something that he can enjoy. And Sebastian Vettel was 12th, looked pretty good. He looked a different sort of driver now. I think he's a bit like Daniel Ricciardo. He knows what he's doing now. He can relax a bit, and he'll probably be driving a little bit better. There's some long corners there where Charles is going to be able to show, particularly in race conditions when the grip goes away or the variables come into play, as I've been saying all year, with some long corners, particularly the two right-handers, which seem to be flat in a Formula One car. And they will become fairly decisive as the weekend goes on. To me, it was all summed up by Lewis afterwards. I love the way he talks when he says, it's just no point in adjusting the car, because as a driver, you are going to get better as this weekend goes on, because the circuit's new, everything's very challenging, and it is a difficult circuit. And it's so refreshing to hear the guy who did a 19.9, whatever it was, out of the box, like over a second quicker than anybody else on his first flying lap, saying that, being that self-critical, and then saying, I think he said something like, and Sector 1 felt a bit weak for me, I'm going to have to work on that. And I just thought, wow, that is why Lewis is, again, why Lewis is who he is and why he's doing as well, because that level of performance is just mind-blowing, really. It's eye-watering, I think, to see that. Anyway, it's all in the realm of Ferrari's history, which is interwoven inextricably with the history of Formula One itself. Even if the Constructors' Championship started here, the Drivers' Championship started here, and they were still racing in Formula One back then, before 1950, with some great drivers and some great cars. But here we are. We got an excuse to celebrate, to say, isn't this amazing? It's a shame it's not a packed Mugello, but then think of this. If it was a packed Mugello, we wouldn't be at Mugello anyway, because we're only there because of COVID. So there have been a couple of glimmers of light, of positive things that have come out of all this. And going to Mugello, I think, is one of them. Anyway, back again tomorrow. See you then.